Hello there, Gerald 508. How are you? All right, so this is going to be the second lecture in this week's series. Today is June 25th, 2019. And so what we're going to do is we are going to go again right into the readings and quizzes, and then from there we'll jump to the discussion. Okay. Now, as I'm going through the readings and quizzes, do think about how the information that we're going to be talking about you can utilize when you do your mock journal paper. Okay, how your intervention will affect a lot of the things that we're going to talk about today. Okay, how you're going to positively affect it so that these really bad things we're going to learn about don't happen. Okay, so we're going to go right in here to the readings and the quizzes. Okay, and last lecture we discussed the concept of clinical depression and how that taps into this stress response. We need the stress response, but there's not the stress response in a continuous, unrelenting, chronic kind of way. And that is the bad thing that is a hallmark of many diseases associated with clinical depression. Things like diabetes, okay? You can be pre-diabetic or full-blown diabetic from too much stress being tapped into, and the stress hormones being a risk factor, or other types of diseases like dementia. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to go now into the second part right here. Okay, so this is again the week of June 24th. Okay, and so we have a couple of papers, and again, I know you guys aren't biologists, so I don't want you to worry about the details on here. I want you to just kind of absorb the concept. Okay, so what I've done is I took out and made a copy of the key points that are raised in this paper. Okay, so we're going to talk about pathological anxiety and chronic stress and how that increases the risk of psychiatric disorders, including depression and dementia. Okay, we're going to talk about the networking. Okay, so I really tried to show you the interaction between this fight or flight, fear, anger response element, the amygdala, and how it triggers all these things that help us if we're being chased by a lion, but are not good if you're worried about your mortgage. Okay, we talked about this thing and how it's regulated by the hippocampus. Okay, through feedback from levels of cortisol and also our cognition and how that affects the activation of this guy. And also the prefrontal cortex, which is right here in the front of our brains, and this is our decision maker. It's our executive that sits there and evaluates all the incoming information and then decides what to do. And usually this prefrontal cortex, under low stress situations where you think it through, can shut off the amygdala, except for if you're a person with high anxiety or clinical depression, because this degenerates and this degenerates. All right? All right. So because of this chronic elevation of cortisol through chronic stress, then you have these stress-induced changes that contribute to a number of disorders. Affective being more clinical depression, cognitive being a dementia. Okay? And the good news from this paper, they talk about how interventions, okay, whether it be psychological help and cognitive behavioral therapy, or through pharmacological help, okay, taking antidepressant medication, okay, can actually turn back the pages and restore the action of your prefrontal cortex and your hippocampus. Okay, so these are all good points. All right, so if you click right here, again, it takes you to the paper. As you can see, if I scroll down, I took that copy of key points right here. So I don't want you guys to get lost in the details, but I just want you to nail, for example, you look at the summary, okay, as it goes through here, and the recent findings. Okay, this is a great overview, okay, where during chronic stress, okay, anxiety disorders, right here, they talk about anxiety disorders, that you have this process in which the amygdala, okay, in its activation to a threat are exaggerated, okay, all right. Remember that normally the prefrontal cortex, right here, and the hippocampus, they're going to regulate this guy, but they're now impaired from the chronic stress, okay? And that's what it is. Again, it's just a reiteration of what I was talking about, okay? So chronic stress causes a degeneration or dying off the prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus, okay? And if that happens and they die off, then this inhibits their ability to take control over your stress response. So you got to take steps, okay, that will intervene, okay? So we have pharmacological examples, okay? So we can have a Zoloft or a Prozac, okay? Trintellix. These are all different kinds of medication that alter your brain chemistry to improve your perception of a threat and lower your likely activation of the stress response, okay? And then, like I said, we have non-pharmacological interventions. So you could write your paper about this using cognitive behavioral therapy or exercise, all right? And then you can, as you're writing it up, you are now experts, and so you can bring in, through this paper, discussion of the circuitry that we've been talking about right here, okay? So this talks about, there's more detail. Prefrontal cortex is a simplification. If you were a crazy neuroscientist beyond my realm, then you would subdivide it into all these subcomponents of prefrontal cortex that do these different types of things, okay? All right, so just don't worry about the details, just sift through it and enjoy the ride, okay? We see the circuitry of the stress response that we've talked about. There is right here the adrenaline rush, okay, all right? And then there's the secondary slow cortisol response, okay? It talks about here the anxiety, the functional neuroanatomy of anxiety and anxiety disorders. And this reiterates what I talked about in terms of the amygdala being able to free run and not be controlled by the hippocampus or the prefrontal cortex. Okay. So as we go through this, okay, we can look at the chronic effects, and we see not only do you have your increased risk of neuroaffective disorders, so we see that chronic stress, okay, increases your pathological load. That's what this is talked about. That increases the risk of diseases like cardiovascular disease, okay, diabetes, metabolic syndrome, and the neuropsychiatric disorders, okay? Alrighty. So we now agree from the previous lecture, okay, and what you guys have learned, and now we're talking about again that that stress exacerbates mental illness and it contributes to a risk for depression. It increases the risk for schizophrenia, bipolar disease, PTSD. All right. And now we're also seeing that it's increasing the risk for Alzheimer's disease 20 years later if you've had this continued chronic stress. Okay. And then this goes into the pathology that is Alzheimer's disease and how stress changes these different types of markers that we see in the brain that you can do through sampling of the cerebral spinal fluid. Okay? All right, so that's what that's all about. And we look down here, and it shows you that if you have an anxiety disorder, scarily, the studies have shown that 3 separate studies, that increase the risk by 33, 78, and 135%, okay, for different types of Alzheimer's disease, whether mild, moderate, or severe. All right, this goes in, and this section again reviewing the circuitry, okay, the dying off or atrophy of the key brain areas that have this feedback or feed forward modulation of this hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. All right, and then over here we look at again the prefrontal cortex and how that affects a lot of your behavior. All right, so you can definitely utilize this, okay, in your analysis. All righty, this right here then is the accompanying paper. So we've mentioned that there was a risk for Alzheimer's disease, and so we see right here then it talks about we've talked about how stress can increase your risk for diabetes, and this paper talks about how diabetes increases your risk for Alzheimer's disease. And like I said, you can do your own Google search, and you'll see that studies have shown that Alzheimer's patients, roughly 80% are diabetic. So I just want you to, again, to just kind of breeze through this. Just look at each major title and study what that says, okay? And then you can go in here and just let it flow, okay? And just don't get hung up on the details. Look at this major title, okay, right here. So we have these 2 factors, okay? Insulin and insulin-like growth factor that increase the production of new cells in our brain. And because the cells become resistant, then you are not able to produce new cells, okay? We also see a link between insulin resistance and some of the pathology seen in Alzheimer's disease. So this is, a review of some pretty significant science, okay? All righty. So that is the point of that paper, okay? Then you come down in here, and there's a real nice review here about the connection between insulin resistance and Alzheimer's disease. So that would be diabetes and Alzheimer's disease, but also stress, okay? Stress-related diabetes and Alzheimer's disease, okay? So we just go right in here, we click on this. It's a nice video, it's 20 minutes long. Down here about the 4-minute mark.
Negative consequences. Insulin resistance is an underlying pathology for almost all vascular risk factors. So insulin resistance leads directly to cardiovascular disease. It leads to hypertension. It leads to small vessel strokes, and it leads to diabetes. So it is the unifying underlying pathology for all of those risk factors, each of which, as we know, contributes to the risk of Alzheimer's disease.
So that's a pretty profound statement, okay? So this whole video is benched in this way that it's easy to understand, it's easy to relate to, okay? So I just want you guys to absorb it. Alrighty, do your quiz right here. Then you come back over here, okay? And we'll look at our discussion, okay? And in this particular discussion, so last time we were focusing on clinical depression and the pathologies, okay? And then we come down here and we look at stress and its risk for affective disorders of dementia. So again, you look at these questions and it's exactly what I discussed in this video, exactly what you now are experts on based on your reading, okay? And we see kind of a quick review right here. And we want you to talk about things like what the changes are that are happening in people's cells and bodies such that diabetes becomes a risk factor for developing Alzheimer's disease. To the best of your abilities, okay, guys? Comment on your friends, okay? To get full credit, you need to have one very substantive post, and then you have to have 3 posts with your classmates, okay? Awesome. All righty. So with that then, again, don't forget that we have, upcoming right here, assignment July 1st, okay? And you can now take all this information and knowledge as we've been presenting it and apply it to your study that you're going to develop, okay? All right, guys. So we will end that, and we'll see you next week.